And that's I think that's one of the things that always keeps people coming back to true crime, because they see how horrible these things are. And I think some people want to know, do I know anybody that's capable of doing this? Mm-hmm.
And it is sinister to look at the posts that Papa Roger was putting on the Facebook page while Kohberger's on the run, because a lot of it, almost word for word in some cases, overlaps with the very questions that Kohberger was putting into his questionnaire of the previous killers when he was, quote unquote, studying it. And the inspiration, I don't even think you should call it that, but the ideological drawing upon he seemed to do with the naming of that account being Roger, and then looking at the nature of the crime, clearly targeting a female out of some sort of weird sexual rage and anger in all likelihood. Also probably because he was rejected in an incel or whatever. It is really, really sinister.
It's very dark. It certainly is. And, people will take the term incel, and trust me, I was not as familiar with the construct as I am now in the wake of Kohberger. But the problem with the term, I think, is, first off, it's not a psychological diagnosis. You can't go into the DSM, the diagnostic manual, and find a diagnosis of being an incel. All right. There might be components that are contained therein, and I've found a lot of pop psychologists that are out there that throw the term around. They should know better, by the way. And I think that, again, that goes to they don't have any other way to kind of categorize him, and that's kind of the easy default position. It's almost like getting closure, where we're avoiding, I think, many times with this idea of incel-like behavior, whatever that means. They'll talk about issues of misogyny. You're walking away as a man. You're isolated. You share common views with other people that have, quote unquote, walked away. And I'm really wondering if we're missing a broader maybe diagnosis or an examination of him and his behaviors, because this is not something that he suddenly decided to participate in. This is something that has been a lifelong journey towards. And maybe he has that commonality with other people, I don't know, that have perpetrated horrible crimes. Maybe those things do exist. But I think that the one thing that should be learned from Kohberger is to try to understand what the genesis of his turning into this thing that he has become is or was, just like with Elliot Rodgers perhaps, but just like with the Nashville shooter too, where, the manifesto, I think, has now been released. I'm not really sure who can keep up with all of the manifestos that are out there. But is there any kind of common linkage between any of these people along their journey? I think that we need to be very careful in using that term, because, again, we're not really getting to the heart of the matter here with Kohberger. It's going to bear a deep dive into his familial history, the impact that his raising. I've heard a couple of people say, well, he was impoverished. He grew up in really bad poverty. I'm thinking, there's a hell of a lot of people who've grown up. I grew up in partial poverty.
That's also not true, I don't think either.
Yeah, and so what does that even mean? What is it that is in his guts? What is it that is in his DNA, literally and figuratively, that would drive him, to do such a crime? And I think that's one of the things that always keeps people coming back to true crime, because they see how horrible these things are, and I think some people want to know, do I know anybody that's capable of doing this? Am I capable of doing this? What would be the motivator for someone wanting to snuff out these lives? I don't know.
When you're dealing with someone who's clearly, and I'm just using a broad term here, is way more complicated and probably worse than this, but clearly sociopathic in nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how much can you even get to that snap point where you're like, oh, that's where it shifted. Now,
Yeah.
it's easier when you can spot something where something horrible happened in someone's life and then talk about people who knew them and the behavior that changed. That, okay, those ones can tie together pretty well. But when it's more of a slow burn or something like that, or something that's developed over time, and there's some other factors in the personality around it that help drive you towards that type of en route, it gets really difficult to ever know the truth.
It does. And look, this person's often cited, but if you look at Dahmer, Dahmer goes back to, he allegedly committed his first homicide when he was a teenager, beat the kid to death, and then discarded his remains there in Ohio. They went back. And of course, his dad had famously, and look, I guess on its surface, if you're a scientist, there's nothing wrong with this, but him and his dad would go out and they would find roadkill and they'd take it back to the house and dissect the roadkill together and to study anatomy, these sorts of things. His dad's this brilliant scientist. And then how did Dahmer develop over the years? Well, we had said, earlier that Kohberger's a junkie. Well, Dahmer was an alcoholic, all right? But just because you're a junkie or an alcoholic doesn't mean that you're going to go into a house off campus at the University of Idaho and completely devastate these kids and their families.
Exactly.
That's not an indicator of anything at that point in time. I don't know that we'll ever know the full depth and breadth of it.
I think about that a lot because I'm not a father at this point in my life, but I plan to be, and it's like there are so many. When the younger a kid is, the more malleable they are. And I'm not just talking about how you are around them. I'm talking about any environment they're in. And it's scary to think about all the different things in this world now that the smallest little, snap of the finger, wrong thing that they see could, get their pathway diverted off to something you don't want. And you think about, for example, the one you just mentioned where it's like, okay, you have a scientific father who's genuinely interested in something, probably for the right reasons, I'm assuming, and happens to drag his kid along to look at this. Oh, let's dissect roadkill, but you don't realize psychologically
what it might be doing.
Yeah, and he's not able to handle, I don't know how old the kid was, but let's say he's 6, he's not able to handle yet the difference between doing that on dead roadkill or a human being.
Yeah, but then I think about generationally too, Julian. I think about, let's just take the Dahmer example with the roadkill. Children for generations and generations have been around butchered animals. What is it about modern times that has driven people to such levels of violence like this? And I know that violence has always been around, okay, but we've never seen it kind of like in the form that it's currently in. I think a lot of the driver, and it's really easy, again, I'm being dismissive by saying this, I think a lot of the driver behind it now is probably social media. I truly believe that. I think that people are exposed to things that they weren't previously exposed to. And if we go with the idea that they're psychologically fragile in any way, what's to say that something couldn't push them over the edge?
For sure.
And that's why they make such a big deal out of cyberbullying and all these sorts of things, because it can perhaps push somebody to do something terrible to someone or to themselves. You never know.
I think you're 100% right. I think we've seen trends and commonality of horrible trends become way worse with social media and the impact that, a kid can have clicking something halfway around the world that is going to change their perspective on things for all the wrong reasons. You can't underestimate that at all. But I think there's also a middle era there that we shouldn't ignore about human nature, which is that even if you look at like the time of Bundy or like Dahmer, this is pre-internet era.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't have social media and things like that. But why suddenly were there way more serial killers than had been known to be in the past? When you look at violent, way worse societies that go back 1,000 years, violence was done out of don't mishear me on this. Violence would come out of a form of survival necessity to a lot of people, including when it was completely wrong on every level. So at a high level where it's more normalized would be like war.
Right.
You know, a tribe's fighting against another tribe and they kill each other, and war's hell and it's ugly. On a lower civilizational level, if someone's starving and another dude is going for food and the two of them haven't eaten in 5 days because they're living in bumblefuck and one guy kills the other to eat, it's not right, but it's a survival mechanism. And so when I look at even before social media, this is just me theorizing with it, and you look at the rise of violence and these creative violence, I would describe it like
I would describe it as now. I would describe it in the world that we're in, social media world, as recreational violence. That people, it's been normalized to the point where people think that it's acceptable behavior to do what they're doing. Even when you look at, folks that are threatened and bullied online, people that are doxxed, all these sorts of things that happen like that. We never in our wildest dreams would we have imagined, that people could be impacted the way they are impacted now by this new thing that's been injected into our system.
And the comfort of being behind a keyboard or even behind a camera, right? And not having to three-dimensionally communicate with people like this, I think, rewires your brain in such a negative way. I've seen it again and again with people that I say would never say something like that to my face or something. Some of those people can be driven to a point where maybe they would and wouldn't even realize they're doing it because they're so disassociated.
It seems like I remember Mike Tyson had quite a interesting quote about keyboard warriors and people that do that sort of thing. And keyboard warriors have driven certainly to a degree this case. Oh my God, the Karen Reed case out of the Boston area up there. That again, a case that's just absolutely bananas, where you had groups of people and it's divided along these lines, where people are, harassing each other and showing up at court with, posters and all these sorts of things.
Horrible.
Super bizarre behavior that I've never seen manifested before.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.